Welcome, everybody. It's a great day for us to be back in person in the parish hall, at least the speakers again, during this period of trying to navigate through COVID. And I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce everybody to Saliha Bava, who is a new guest speaker for us, and reintroduce everybody to Mark Greene. Mark, as you may remember, joined us last fall. I had first gotten the opportunity to meet him as a writer. He was actually the senior editor at the Goodman Project as I was submitting various essays to that publication. And we met and became friends. And our shared interest in those conversations has been addressing the challenges of the dominance-based culture of masculinity that is wreaking havoc on us all. And so we started that conversation last fall with Mark, but we very quickly came to the understanding that, in fact, there was a larger crisis going on, and that's really the crisis in connection, which is at the heart of all of this. And Mark suggested that we bring in Saliha, who happens to also be his life partner. So Saliha is a professor of psychology, a marriage and family therapist. She's at Mercy College and sits on any number of boards. And Mark's rationale for this was actually that what we really needed to do was to dig into how we can build healthy relationships so that we can combat some of the impacts of COVID and social media and this culture of masculinity. And so today we are going to engage in that conversation with both Mark and Saliha. Welcome, and I really look forward to diving into this with you.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Mark. I'll go next. My name is Mark Greene. As Mark shared, he and I have spent a lot of time together at the Goodman Project and elsewhere having this larger conversation about dominance-based masculinity, our so-called man-box masculinity, our culture of masculinity, and how it is contributing to the larger crisis of connection. And when we talk about a crisis of connection, we're quoting some language from author and researcher Niobe Way, who's at NYU University. And she's done a lot of research around the mechanisms and the forces culturally which cut us off from a more robust culture of relationships, and instead moves us into sort of isolated, hierarchical, dominance-based social systems. And the end result of this, of course, is deeply harmful for everyone. So our conversation today is going to be about how we can look for ways in our parenting and in our in the process of being in families together to grow our capacity to form healthy, lasting relationships. So I'm really happy to be here with Saliha. She and I have been parenting my son for a long time. She became my son's bonus mom when he was 4. He's now 16,
Yep.
Bonus mom. And so much of what we'll talk about today came out of research from people like Niobe Way, came out of Saliha's work as a couple and family therapist, but also came out of our process of parenting Gus.
Yeah. And so before we jump in, as a marriage and family therapist, I just want to say this, that what we're going to talk about is a conversation. And if there are more challenging issues, if you have questions, concerns, to seek out a professional, because I don't want to be in that professional advice-giving capacity here without understanding the context that people are coming from. So that I want to put that out. And the second thing is I run a lab called the Relational Play Lab, where we play with ideas, where we explore how to foreground relationality in different spaces of our lives. So I'm going to be pulling both from my practice, from that research work, and from our own personal life as we talk. And we want to invite all of you to jump in and put your questions in, thoughts. Let's make it interactive, because we have somebody here behind the scene who's going to be your voice and forward those questions and comments to us. So I want to put that out, that we should keep it engaged and interactive.
Yeah, that'll be Sharon, who's helping us. You'll be hearing from Sharon in a little while.
And you'll be seeing her, hopefully, yes. So, should we play the video as a way to introduce our...
Yes. So we're going to share a 2-minute video, which is a promotional video for our book, but it has a lot of the kinds of ideas and languages in it that'll help us inform the conversation today. So if we can just share that video now.
Who we are and what we become in the world is not simply the product of ourselves or some internal aspect of ourselves, but it is the product of the network of relationships we're embedded in.
The book is not about who we are as parents. The book is who do we become in the process of engaging with our children. As we are shaping them, they are shaping us. An important part of relational thinking is attending to the process of relating. What are we creating in the process of engaging with each other?
For me, to discover that I have some agency in those relationships, in those spaces, that there are ways I can operate that help me not fall prey to my own doubts or fears or concerns, all of that stuff is huge. It's a huge deal to me.
This book is a reminder of how, in the course of parenting, we're teaching our children how to be in relationships.
Challenges are always going to be there in families, in the world. We know this. But if we have more flexibility, if we can look at problems from more angles, if we can hold our fears and our concerns more lightly, if we can be more playful and more collaborative, if we can wait and see what's emerging before we name and define our responses, all of these things are possible. And when we do it, we have a better chance of getting where we want to be.
Our culture doesn't train us to think in terms of relationship. It trains us often to think in terms of roles and jobs and tasks and goals that we have to get done by the end of the day. We want to ground our families back in that notion of relating, in the activity of making a family. This book is about that.
So the conversation today is about this idea of grounding our families back in relationships. And with that, I think we'd like to invite Mark into the conversation and begin to explore some of the ideas of what's going on with this concept of relational spaces and relating.
And before we jump to you, Mark, I have a question for the audience here.
Ah, yes.
And Sharon is going to type it into the chat window. And my question is, what are the most challenging issues of parenting? And you may be a parent, you may be somebody who works with parents, you may be somebody who assists parents, you may be a school teacher, you might be a grandparent. What do you see as the issues, the challenging issues of parenting?
Yeah,
So just
especially
chat it
during COVID times, the other sort of challenges we're facing currently. How does that show up in terms of your challenges as someone who is with children and working with children?
So as you take a minute to think about that, I want to say one thing as I was watching that video that came. And that is, as a therapist, and I train, for 20, 30 years I've been training therapists. And the number one question we ask our therapists in training to ask individuals or families is, what's your social support? Because we believe relationships buffer that which is challenging in our life. And so the centrality of relationships is why I do this work. But I want to take it further today and say it's not just relationship as in, oh, we are a couple here and that's a relationship. We are friends here, that's a relationship. It's the activity of making that. How do we relate together to create that healthy buffer? And amazing interpersonal neurobiology research is showing that relationships not only buffer, they shape us. They literally structure our brains.
Right.
So,
So we'll start with Mark in a larger conversation. Just know that later in this conversation, we're going to bring some actual relational capacities, some games, some ideas, and some ways that you can use right away.
yeah.
So Mark, take it away.
Sure. So I realized coming into this conversation and also how we started today that you're probably scratching your head wondering, like, so what are we really going to talk about today? And I can honestly say, who knows? But what I'm bringing to the room today is that I have spent now many years, almost 30 years, pouring myself into parenting, and have done so joyfully. And I am still finding that I am discovering new things, even as I am interacting with now my adult children. So it's reading your book was just a fascinating journey for me, because it was not only revisiting some of the things that I had stumbled into, because of course our kids don't come with instruction manuals, so we have to sort of figure it out through trial and error. But I also found myself actually kind of discovering new things that I haven't stumbled into, and realizing that they are very much relevant even today in interactions with our sons, or with individuals that I am interacting with either professionally or on a personal level. So this notion of developing our relational capacities at precisely the time that we are most, in some ways, feeling hampered and unable to do so because we're not physically present as much as we normally are. I just think it's an important conversation for us today, and I'm eager to explore a lot of the ideas that you presented in the book. I think the thing that really first got my attention was this whole notion of the relational space as an entity in and of itself. I mean, I think that sometimes we think about relationships as kind of being transactional between two people without actually acknowledging the space that we...
Yeah, and we perform them that way too.
Yeah, and it gets us into a lot of trouble because we need that space in order to have the flexibility to play and reframe and do some of the things that you've suggested. So,
Yeah.
We actually have a slide, right?
We do have a slide. As they're pulling up the slide, I'm going to say to the audience, notice how the relational space is coming into being here. We already came in a relationship, but what is the game here? What's the play here? So you want to speak to the slide?
Sure. This is an image from the book, and it basically gives you a way to sort of visualize what a relational space is. And the idea that Mark brought up about transactional relationships, that is, I'm me over here and he's him over there, and we exchange things back and forth in some method of transacting. But when you hold this idea that we create in every single relationship in our lives, everything from long-term partnerships to the guy at the corner grocery that we say hello to in the morning, that we create this third space, this relational space, where the choices that we make and the things that we say shape what goes on, what gets created in the relationship, and that it is not wholly me or wholly you, it is the us, the third entity, if you will. And when we start to become mindful of what we're creating in that relational space, we get a lot more agency, right? A lot more options, a lot more instant ways to sort of shift and pay attention and, create relationships.
So the other thing I want to say about the relational space is we are human beings bound in our bodies. So when we look at anything, we are attuning to this notion of a thing or a body, if that makes sense, something that's contained. And this relational space is something that's more like our breath. It expands and contracts based on how we are engaging with each other. It's not a fixed thing. It's not like, oh, we got married, now we got the relational space, now it's a thing, and we have it. We have to keep feeding it, we have to nurture it, and allow it to act on us as we're acting on it. Meaning, feel its presence, sense if it is there or not.
Well, and I love that idea of it not being a fixed thing, because that means then that even though we sometimes do get locked into, patterns of behavior over a long period of time, there's always the possibility that that things can change. And if we just kind of look at that space as having a life of its own, then at any given moment, something entirely new could happen if we choose to make it happen.
An extremely liberating idea for me, because for a long time when I was struggling in relationship to someone, my sense was, I could go to a therapist and I could look in here somehow for the solution, go back, do work on my past events or whatever that was, and it felt like a huge thing to take on, Like I had to go fix something that was broken in here before I could successfully be in relationship. Relational spaces are actually these organic, moving, alive entities that we can, I can reach out and thump that thing and make a bad outcome very easily. I can do it instantly. In the same way, I can reach out and take a moment of connection with someone and create something warm and remarkable. And that seems to me to be a place I'd rather do my work, right? I'd rather try to understand what's going on there and do my work there instead of going back and dealing with stuff that, it's important to go back and deal with your old business. I don't discount that. But it's the second place where we can have some agency, and I'm really glad that it came into my life, my understanding of that.
And I was also thinking that in a way it's sort of like a sandbox in which we can play, and especially with our children who don't perhaps have the sort of deeply ingrained sort of narratives that maybe we do as adults. Their space is a little bit more open and new. And so if we can think about helping them kind of continue to understand that space is available to them and to nurture it and see every relationship as a sort of range of possibilities instead of kind of something that's quickly etched in stone.
And what you're saying is very powerful here, Mark, because we can think as parents, we are teaching them about relational space. So what we're talking today can become a model. And I want to caution against that. We are not here saying, here is the new model of parenting, the relational model, right?
Right.
What we're trying to say is this is something you're probably already doing. Like you started us out. It's just that we're here giving it language, and like breath, those of you who do yoga or do some kind of mindfulness practice, spiritual practice, it is a practice of mindfulness by first starting to notice what you notice, and then how do you stay attentive and aware to this thing that we are calling the relational space, right? So it's that thing that's, again, I keep coming back to the word that it's felt. We can't teach it to our children, but we can enjoy it and appreciate it with them, because we all know when we feel good with each other and when we feel something is off. And this is a way of languaging and noticing what is it that we are co-creating together.
Right. And I think it also puts our children in the place of having a lot of personal agency and also the ability to shape the relationship. I mean, I always joke around that I'm a project and the boys are raising me. And it is true.
That is true.
It is absolutely
I think so.
true.
Yeah.
And I think and I understand it better actually thinking about it as this space that we jointly hold and bring ourselves into, and then have this exchange that continues to grow as it is now over time.
Yeah. A friend of mine, Brian Anderson, at Fathering Together, said, he said, we all got the books about parenting before our first child arrived, and we read them. And he said, when my daughter was born, and I'm paraphrasing him here, but I think I'm pretty close, he said, what I came to understand is that I needed to discover how to co-design parenting with my daughter. And he said, that's the stuff that I really wanted to learn about. And the idea that we can be aware that parenting relationship, and by the way, the part where we get to later in this conversation about relational capacities, games, etc., are exactly about how that relational space, how we can get in there and create connection and a container for them to bring their full selves and all of these ideas in that relational space. But when Brian talks about co-designing parenting, what you're doing is you're giving away the idea, you're setting aside the idea that I'm here to raise a child by teaching and telling and all that. And those things are necessary and important. There are moments when you have to say to your child, do not step off the curb into traffic. That's not negotiable. We're not co-designing that idea. But we get so caught up as parents in the idea of, I have to get all of these things done for my kid if they're going to have safety and success later in life, that everything becomes lists and to-dos and goals and activities and whatever. Now, you said, Saliha, earlier that these relational spaces and ideas are things we're already doing. Mm-hmm. But the whole culture is aligned around the idea that we pay attention to grades in school, we pay attention to algebra, we pay attention to scouts, we pay attention to sports and tasks. If we can take part of that energy and shift it over to noticing what we're doing in forming relationships with our children that are truly equitable and truly invite them to bring their ideas and all of that, then what we're going to do is give them the other half of what it means to be human, which is not just to do and make and create and succeed, but to also connect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So here's a moment of connection. In the chat window, I would just want to invite people to reflect on these couple of ideas as to what's coming, so connect with yourself. What's coming up for you as you hear Mark 1 speak about the project of parenting is the parents are not the project. I mean, the children are not the project, the parents are the project. What happened when you heard Mark say that? Because that's such a different idea of what it is to be, who's being parented? Is Mark saying that he's getting parented, or is he saying it's a project of connection, to the second point, right? So the chat invitation is, where does this idea land for you? When you connect, when you hear that idea, where in your body do you connect? Do you feel something? Do you feel like, what the heck? My kid needs so much. What are you saying that, why are you giving them the permission to parent me? I don't think we're talking about parenting. I think that's the second idea you're talking about.
Well, think of it this way, Saliha, that in that moment, what Mark is talking about is, when my child was born, I didn't instantly become a parent in the sense that everything I had to do and learn and become was forthcoming, was coming over time, and would continue to come, I would suggest, until the day I die. I'm still becoming something new in that space. And when we open ourselves up to the idea that we are, in fact, in an emergent process where, I mean, because anyone who's parented a child knows and understands that if we think we have it figured out, 3 weeks later they've evolved and changed and we got to start over again.
Right.
And
to figure out what works.
Actually,
right?
I would say a baby does that all the time, right? The first few years of having 0 to 3 months, the rapid change, and the 1-year-olds and the 3-year-olds. I work a lot with couples who have newborns, right?
Yes.
And my work is not with parenting, but it's the work that happens on the co-design. What do the couples want to be doing?
Yeah.
Because the rate of change is so fast. But here's what happens. These kids grow up. I don't know why you all grow up so, I don't know why we grow up so fast.
Why are they doing that?
Yeah, but we, as we start growing as parents, we forget that the rate of change still continues and there's still co-designing happening,
Yeah.
right? That the child is still teaching us what they need. When the child coos or when the child goes, Yeah, we're like, what? What are you trying to say? You want to go to the diaper change, food, water?
Really inquisitive at that
Right.
point. We're like,
but
tell me.
something happens when
Yeah.
they get older and they get language. We don't get as curious. We get more literal with them.
Yeah. And we're more sure of what needs to happen.
Right.
You got to get that homework done. You got to do
Yeah.
this. You got to do that. Instead of understanding that there is a huge amount of human connection right there, and sometimes we don't take advantage of the beauty of that's happening. And once we start to focus only on teaching and telling, I think we miss the human connection. That people say, "Oh, my teenagers never talk to me." I don't know about your experience, but my experience with my son who's 16 is that he talks to me.
Yeah.
He speaks to me because I've always tried to hold space for what does he think and what is his view of the society that he's in and the culture he's in and what is his view of the culture of our family and how's it going for him, and he's very much ready to continue to share his part of that co-designing process. So I hope.
So then the question comes, if it is about co-designing,
Yeah.
and if parenting is a project where our kids are acting upon us,
Right.
Yeah.
then what do we do? What are the skills? What do we have to bring so we can be acted upon? Or what do we have to bring to allow for that co-design to happen?
I think there's a lot of listening and a lot of improvisation as well. That at least those two things for sure. And also, a willingness to entertain lots of possibilities and not always have all the answers. I mean, I think that's really important.
So how do we do that? Because we do have so much. We want our children to succeed.
Right.
And we know how they should proceed in the world because the world is sometimes not always good. It's sometimes ugly and bad. And we want them to avoid those areas, and we want them to go to a place which is going to be good for them. So what do I do with this thing
Good question.
that I know?
Can we take a moment and see
Yeah.
what's coming up in
Yeah,
the chat?
yeah,
We
yeah.
have 2 questions floating out there,
Yeah,
Sharon.
thank you for that.
We do. So in response to the first question, which is, what are the most challenging issues for parenting? I'm seeing it sort of varies based on what age of the child you are parenting. Mom of a teenager said getting teenagers to open up and talk to me is challenging. They'll
Yeah.
avoid any question. From a parent of small children, giving them a sense and understanding of things that are difficult to grasp, like COVID, like death, is a challenge.
Wow.
And then someone has a situation where their children live with an ex, and how do you maintain that relationship and make sure that there's healthy communication there? So, I think there's a lot of different situations. For myself, it's being present when I'm with my daughter, because I have a list of 75 things going on in the back of my head as I'm trying to engage and play with her. So
Boy, I hear that
there's a
one.
whole lot coming
That's a
up
big one.
Yeah.
in the chat. And then in response to the second question, are we learning from our children just as they are learning from us? I think it's hard to, when you have multiple children that maybe need to be parented differently, and to try and figure that out. And so what are you able to teach them, and what are you able to learn from them as different human beings that need different things from their parents?
Wow. Great stuff.
Yes. Do you want to take one of them? Do you want to?
I think the couple and family therapist should start out for this. 'Cause
I just told them I'm here to have a chat, not give professional advice. But here's what I'll say. I love these questions. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you.
My first thing is drop into your breath. It's really hard what we're talking about. It is an improvisation. But when we talk about connection, it's also connecting to this idea of we are connected to each other. We are connected through our breath to the people around us and to the environment around us. So one of the things that happens with teaching and telling is we really get tunnel vision and we forget this expansiveness. So this notion of relational parenting is not just about the relationship that we build with each other, it's also this notion of that we are all related, we are all interconnected. So this is not just an activity that I do to my children or my children do with me, but I can lean on each other. And that's what community is. I mean, when you talk about the Trinity Spiritual Center, it's a community. So this notion of how, and I think we're losing that. All my family is in India. I'm here by myself, right? So that sense of community that I can have from the larger sense of being in my own ethnic community, I have to create it by connection, by making those relationships. So I think the further we move out, we also move in, which is we close down what might be options. So all this to say, breathe and center, some kind of centering practice by which we can breathe out and breathe in expansion is one of the first things I would say. When the world feels small, when we're overwhelmed with tasks, to notice what is your practice of connection to yourself, to your breath, and to the world around you. How does that help you with the task? It creates a sense of expansion that allows for creativity to come in. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the answer lies in the improvisation. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it lies in turning to the child and saying, you know, we used to really play a lot when you were 8 years old. Mm-hmm. Now that you have turned 13, something has changed. What's changed? Right? Don't complain, get curious. If you complain, you don't hug me anymore. You used to hug me a lot.
Yeah.
Now you don't hug me. That's a complaint. But if you're like,
I'm reminded of a story when Gus was little, 6 or so. He was very late to tying his shoes. Now I could have made a thing out of that, but I remember trying to teach him to tie his shoes, and it was not something he really cared about or that he had picked up or made sense to him. And my instinct in that moment was to say, dial back a little bit and say, he's got 16 remarkable things he knows how to do. Great at drawing, all these different capacities that he has. Not everything's going to come along at the same rate. So I'm going to make this into a game, because making it into a game gives me something to do with my imagination in the moment that I'm trying to teach him to tie shoes. So I said, Gus, these are 2 snakes. And he looked at them and he was like, I said, these snakes are going to wrap around each other and they're going to do this thing. And if it goes just right, then they're going to get married. And I did this whole story, and I said, this snake was a little bit resistant, though. This snake didn't want it, so I pulled it over here. And 2 minutes later, I've gone into this whole sort of enjoyable game with him. It's no longer about get your shoes on, we have to get out the door in 30 seconds, which I understand that pressure. But instead, I just took the pressure off the situation. Mm-hmm. And then I finished by tying his shoe, and on we went, right? And for me, I think whenever I felt with a small, and this is working with small children, whenever I felt that sense of, I got to get this done, I got to get this done, whenever that happened to me, I thought, okay, I can spend the next 2 minutes trying to get an outcome, or I can spend the next 2 minutes letting go and playing with my child. Mm-hmm. And when he is 30 years old and thinks back on me as his dad, is he going to remember what I taught him to do, or is he going to remember how I was with him? Mm-hmm. And I have pretty much banked all of my parenting on this idea that if his memory of being with me was warm and funny and unpredictable and interesting, then much of what I will need out of him in terms of agreement, cooperation, co-creation will come more easily. And in fact, that has sort of been what's come out of it, luckily. I can't say what would happen with every parenting experience, but in my experience, the idea of connection and relating and being playful gave me a lot of credit in the bank for what I had to ask of him over time.
And so that, I just want to add a couple of things to it, what you're saying.
Yeah.
One is, just like every child is different, as Sharon was saying, somebody mentioned that have more than one children, every parent is different. Gus, when I remember the first time I went to pick him up in school, mostly Mark used to drop and pick him up at school. And they used to go to this, what is it, a donut place or something like that. And I pick him up, I'm headed straight home, I've got all these things to do, so I'm headed home. And he says, Saliha, no, we go to this donut place.
And we didn't always go to the donut place.
So there it was, right? So to the parent who said, how do you help kids grasp challenging concepts? The thing is, are we ready to delve in complexity? Are we ready to talk about death? And how do we talk about it? Are we ready to talk about, like respect? I find respect is an abstract concept, but in my culture, it's like, you have to respect parents. What does that mean? Right? So there is that moment. He's got to respect me. I'm the parent. We're standing in this middle of the road, trying to cross, and anybody who has a 6-year-old knows if they're going to throw down, they're going to throw down at that moment. We're like, nope, here is the donut shop. I'm like, nope, we're crossing. Here's the donut shop. Nope, we're crossing. And then suddenly, I don't have the storytelling abilities that you do, Mark, but what I do have is that relating part.
Right.
And I said, I'm getting caught up here. And I said, you know, what you do with dad is the way you do it with dad. And you and I are going to figure out how we are going to do our thing. That's an abstraction. And children know how to do this because they have friends, they have family members, they have different parents when you're co-parenting. They know how to be in different spaces.
And to be different with different people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we have that plurality of selves by which we know how to engage people. And so how do we grow that in our children? And often in our house, we use the language of, which version are you playing today? Which version do you want me to play today? So I think even with parents who have more than one child, or if you have one child, the idea of plurality is really important. As I think somebody was hinting, that you have to be different with different people, with different children, but we have to also be different with ourselves over different times. And we have to build that difference as a value. And that's why we believe that relational parenting can allow for collaboration and connection, because once you start valuing difference, and this is what I would say to the couples who are trying to co-parent, how do you notice and talk about difference in your family? Is it spoken as right and wrong? Is it, oh, dad, that's just dad being dad? You're signaling something when you signal that's just dad being dad. How is it different if you kind of bring in, yeah, dad has a way of telling stories. I don't, but I can make interesting sounds. Can we make sounds? And it's a different way of engaging by which children start attuning to who we are rather than, I want you to be like dad or I want you to be like mom.
I would also say that
Or the other mom.
The co-parenting challenge, which I have done, I've done that work, there is one hard and fast rule of that world, and that is that you don't put the child in the middle, ever. And so the ways in which we choose to be with our children when we are co-parenting very much have to do with making huge space for what they're up against in terms of being in different households and moving back and forth, holding a lot of space for your co-parenting partner, your ex-spouse, if that's who that is, and creating stories out of what is positive, doing an appreciative inquiry, saying, I have issues with my ex-partner, but boy, she's good at this. And you speak into those spaces, and you speak into those ideas. And all you're really trying to do is keep that co-parenting relationship going until that child is old enough
Can-
to have their own way of being. And that's also about creating a big container with a lot of room in it, a lot of space. And that's one thing that I will speaking to that co-parenting question, which is a very challenging space.
Can you say a little bit of what is appreciative inquiry?
Sure. Appreciative inquiry is just, you can apply it in workspaces, you can apply it in families, you can apply it wherever you want, but it's the idea that instead of noticing what's going wrong, we're going to pay attention to what's going right and grow that, right? So the teaching and telling space, parenting, can often be a process of spotting and noticing what's not working. Your clothes are on the floor, you didn't hang up your towel, you're not finishing your food. I mean, the list is endless, right? And I have fought those battles, friends, I can tell you. And I came to understand intuitively that you really have to decide how much of that stuff you want to focus on. Because I can also notice that my son is intentionally being thoughtful or careful about a friendship with another boy in his class. Or I can notice that he's really willing to take some feedback on a drawing and make some changes in it. I can notice where he's permeable to my influence. And I can spot those things and I can thank him for it and I can grow that connection, right? So when we talk about relational practices, we're going to go there. And I don't know when we want to begin looking at some of those ideas.
I think now may be a good time to share a couple,
Okay. So when you talk about appreciative inquiry, I'm going to go straight to one of our games in the book. And it's called the Caught You Doing Something Right game. And when Gus was young, and one of the joys of creating a relational space with your child, and you can do this at age-appropriate ways when they're as young as 3 and 4 years old.
And we're still doing it.
Yeah. When you start to invite this idea, in fact, we have a slide, a second relational space slide, and it's a good visualization of what happens when in that relational space when we offer our child a simple question and then fall silent, versus teaching and telling, versus filling that space with our ideas. And what I've tried to illustrate in this drawing is the moment of agency for a child when you ask them a big life question or a small life question, and then you say, tell me. And they begin to push their ideas into that relational space. So they're not just taking in your ideas, they're beginning to give their own interpretations about things. And if you give them room to do that, they can fill that space with ideas. So when we did the Catch You Doing Something Right game, we were already benefiting from this work with Gus. We had a young attorney on our hands. We had a debater. We had someone who talks back. And by talk back, I don't mean he's talking back. I mean he talked back. He said, well, I don't think so. I think this and that and the other. And sometimes those conversations would get a little frustrated. And sometimes I would find myself noticing what he wasn't doing right and all that. And ultimately I said, I want to do appreciative inquiry. I want to start noticing what he's doing right. So the game worked like this. Gus would be doing something at his table and Saliha would be working at her desk. And I would come in and I would point at him and I'd say, gotcha. I caught you. And he'd look up and he'd be like, what? And I'd say, I caught you doing something right. And he'd go, oh, okay. What'd I do? What'd I do right? Tell me. And I'd say, oh, I'm not going to tell you. You got to guess. And he'd say, oh, come on, Dad, give me a clue. What did I do? Give me a hint. And I'd say, okay, it's kind of in the back part of the house, you know, and I'd look over and Saliha would be getting up from her chair and coming over, you know, and I'd go back and I'd say, I think it was in this room, you know, and Gus would look around the corner into the bathroom and he'd go, oh, I hung my towel up. And I'd go, yeah, very good, nice job. And we'd get a sticker, we had a big poster board and we had Saliha, Dad and Gus, and I'd, you know, stickers, and I'd stick one under Gus, and when he got, you know, 10 stickers, he'd get $5 or ice cream or, you know, whoever. Any one of us could get a reward for stickers on the Caught You Doing Something Right game. And what that got our family into the habit of doing was highlighting moments when something went well and then creating enough of a game out of it where it was kind of sticky information, but the information was not only sticky in terms of what he did right, but the joy and pleasure and the gamification of that moment made him feel like they see me. You know, they notice my efforts.
So I want to comment on a couple of things on that, and I know we want to go into a breakout soon around this too,
Okay.
right? So, as we're talking about this, caught you doing right game, and we start sharing, I just want to make a distinction that we're not here to talk about play as gamification. It absolutely has that value, and this is an example of how we did it. We're talking about play in the way you were talking about earlier, in the improvisational sense of it, in the not knowing sense of it, in the trial and error way of it, right?
In the holding our ideas more lightly way of it.
Right. And so I'm wondering if you want to set it up a little bit to talk about a couple of the relational wheel, couple of things, and tie it back to this.
Right, but I'll bring one more piece to the Caught You Doing Something Right game before I leave it. And that is that, you know, at some point later, when Gus was 7 or 8, I remember we would do the game to each other, right? And occasionally an adult would walk through the room at some point and point at the thing and say, I have very few stickers, I'm not feeling seen here in these.
So watch out for the byproducts of it.
And people would go, oh, right, you know, and but at one point Gus came to me and he pointed at me, he said, caught you doing something right, Dad. And I said, oh, and I was doing the dishes. And I said, oh, doing the dishes? And he said, no, Dad, that's not it. And I said, okay, what was it? Give me a hint. He said, well, you did it about an hour ago. And I said, oh, what'd I do? Was it in this room? He said, it's in this room right here. Okay, so you got to tell me. He said, well, Dad, about an hour ago, you started to get a little bit annoyed, and then I saw you catch yourself. I saw you stop. And I thought, okay, where's my sticker? And he took the sticker and he went over and he put it up. And in the moment that your child looks at you and says, here's your sticker for caring about the relationships in this family, and you realize an 8-year-old can track that stuff, and you realize you have gotten to the place with your child where they have the courage to critique you in that way, to say, I saw this and it went well and here's your sticker. I realized in that moment that the power of that game was a two-way street, because how often do we ever get validated as parents? Ever. I mean, if anybody applied appreciative inquiry to us, I think we'd fall down, because it's so much about, well, we have to do what Mom and Dad want, instead of we love Mom and Dad and we care about their efforts. So this is one example, but if you want to go to the relational wheel now, we have things called relational capacities, and then we have games in the book. And the relational capacities speak more specifically to what agency in that relational space. And we actually have a spinner. We have a game spinner, because for us it's all about being playful, right?
Yeah.
So you'll see the relational wheel up on the screen there, and there are 6 capacities there. At the top is stay playful, followed by listening with curiosity, reframe our stories, consider context, ask questions, and hold uncertainty. And all of these relational capacities help care for what you see as the relational space in the center. Now, stay playful is at the top of the circle for us because it is an intention. It is an intention that informs the other capacities. And what it basically says is, I'm going to hold my ideas more lightly. I'm going to be open to a playful, improvisational process in that relational space. I can begin with listen with curiosity as a relational capacity, and I'm going to just explain to you how it works. So every conversation that we have with someone that we've worked with for 10 years, with someone we've been married to for 20 years, with someone we met 2 hours ago, with our children, in every context, every conversation can be informed either in a sort of narrow way by our expectation. Oh, I've known this person for a long time. I pretty much know how this conversation is going to go. Or we can take a different tack, and we can say, I'm going to listen to this conversation with curiosity. I'm going to set aside, hold more lightly, the stories that I have about this person that has formed my prediction of how they'll respond. Oh, I have to talk to my partner about the household budget, and I know what my partner's going to say, but we got to have this conversation, so we're going to have it. Instead, I can go into any conversation with my child, with my partner, with my coworker, and say, I expect to be surprised, and I expect to learn something new. Now, any conversation has numerous threads, right? So let's say, for instance, that you start this conversation about the household budget, and your partner says the thing that you expected them to say. And so you note that. You say, okay, that's one of the threads. But there are other threads in every conversation, and your partner may also say, well, I had this crazy idea, and it was kind of like this, but it will never work. And that's what I would call an unexpected thread, a new bit of green growth. And in the moment that you choose to let go of that primary thread that you expected and say, hey, well, tell me more about that. What's going on over there? And they say, oh, well, I had this idea that maybe we could do X. And you say, oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't have expected that of you. That's really kind of a new way of thinking about it, isn't it? Yeah, I've been thinking about this. And suddenly, you're noticing the other threads in any conversation that's always there. And in that moment, you're also acknowledging something crucially important, that the stories we have about people and the ideas we have about people are never accurate for very long. That people are changing, they're emerging, our children are growing and changing, our partner is evolving. And when we choose to be curious and listen with curiosity and expect something new, what we're seeing is that process that we talked about earlier, whereas I'm shaping you, you're shaping me. We're watching that process happen, we're noticing where it's taking place. The big challenge for us, I think, when we think about things like marriage or work, is that, you know, I got married 10 years ago, I found my wife, we got married, everything's fine, we have that. It's a static idea. And so we're looking at the place where that person was 10 years ago and saying, I don't want you to change, I want you to stay what you were, because that's comfortable for me. Meanwhile, they're evolving, changing, moving down the road of life, they've gone over the hill and into the valley beyond, and we're still looking at that one spot. Then it shouldn't come as a surprise to us that that person says, I don't know you anymore. But when we set aside these stories that predict what people are and what they're going to become and what they're going to say every darn time, and instead listen with curiosity, we enter that relational space, we look for new growth, we discover the person they're becoming, and we go together with them down that road in conversation over time. So that's a big piece of relational thinking, and it holds other ideas from the wheel.
Can I say something to that?
Yeah.
A couple
Thank
of more
you for
ideas.
letting me go a little long on that, but it's a story I love.
I have so many thoughts about it, but part of this idea of listening with curiosity opens up this third part, which is leaning into uncertainty. Because that thing, like by the time you say things, two more things come along, I'm like, okay, I'm ready now. I want to speak. I want to say something. And that process of learning how to relate to uncertainty goes hand in hand with listening with curiosity. Because if I'm full of anxiety, I can't hang on there. So I would say start listening with curiosity with some baby steps. And it's an intention, so hold it. Today I'm going to give a story here. Gus and I both love to cook. Right? And for whatever reason, when we are in the kitchen, in the cooking space, that's where we jam up against each other. Go figure. If you know of a good therapist, let me know. So he and I have been playing at this for nearly now, I would say what, close to 8, 7.
You should see me roll out of the room sometimes.
Yeah,
I'm like,
yeah.
oh, okay, they're going to work this out.
He just did it took Mark's uncertainty, leaning into his uncertainty, to leave us to figure it. So that is one thing, which is how does the third person not jump in? But the other uncertainty was, if I'm going to say something, in whatever version I'm using, will Gus respond to the older version or the newer version? And the same thing on his end. When he is asking me a question, and he just did. We were learning some new dish this week, and he was going to deep fry, and I freak out about children and deep fryers. Why should we freak out? I don't know, but we should, I think. Anyway, so he's just learning to fry, And he said, I'm going to do something. And I went, no. And he was like, Saliha. Remember, we have been at this for nearly 7 to 8 years now, how we do kitchen work. He said, no, he dropped his voice. He was very, because Mark has also been working on with Gus, on how he addresses me when he says, Saliha, Saliha, Saliha. They're all three different tonalities, right? And so he went, Saliha, when you say no, can you just bring it down a notch or two? That's the project, right?
We have to, you have to set this story in context a little bit.
Oh, go for it. You're the storyteller.
When children learn to cook, you're like, oh boy, I don't have to make an egg for him. He can make an egg. And of course, it's kitchen Armageddon. I mean, eggshells that way and food everywhere and stuff on the floor. I mean, it's a wrecking ball experience until you try to get them to also pay attention to what the kitchen looks like when they're done making their egg. So there's food waste, there's messiness, there's all kinds of issues that come into it. And for Saliha and Gus, there was a lot of back and forth around waste, messiness. You made 150 gallons of macaroni and cheese. Why do we need that much?
Culture.
Right.
In my culture, we don't do this.
Yes, exactly. We don't do this in my culture. So all of that it came along over the process of years.
Yes.
But Gus initially took the feedback as he bristled. He was like, get out of the kitchen. I'm doing something in here, whatever. He wanted his space around that. And why Gus was reactive in the kitchen in ways he was not in other parts.
Right.
Every child and every parent there are going to be places where you hit that little moment of real resistance. And it may be around skateboarding, and it may be around homework, and it may be around cooking. Who knows? There may be areas where things go really well and areas where things are resistant. So the process that you and he went through to get to this place where Gus said, could you lower your voice a little on the no, was like a journey over time.
And I want to bring it back to uncertainty, play, and listening with curiosity. Listening with curiosity is momentary, but it's, in this example that I'm sharing, it's a journey of years. Continuing, both of us listening with curiosity, what is the other person trying to? I mean, I am so proud of Gus because his reactivity was that much. Because after I went, he would go, wah, and then we would go, wah, and then boom, right? I think anybody can relate to that, minor versions of it.
And I would step in like, you guys need it, and they would be like, get out, and I'd go, okay, I'm out.
And what we achieved this week was that process that goes off into that came to his ability to know where his fuse goes off is when I raise my voice in that fashion of saying no. And he nuanced that it's not the no, it's the tonality. That's the appreciative moment that I could see that. And in that moment, and this again comes from the neurobiology of interpersonal behaviors or understanding interpersonal neurobiology, that everybody wants to be seen. We have this felt sense when somebody sees us. And when I could see him and he could see me, we both connect.
There's a whole narrative in culture, dominance-based masculine culture, which we did a lot of work around in a previous session here. But what happens is boys are trained out of emotional expression, shamed out of showing their authentic selves. All of this process by which we lock down their expression. And the end result is, and that's dominance-based masculine culture saying, what are you a sissy, what are you a girl, what are you whatever, if a boy gets emotional or if a boy does any of the too giddy, too joyful, needs friendships too much, whatever. Our dominant culture teaches boys to be stoic, to act tough all the time. We all know the drill. But one of the things that takes place when they fall prey to that cultural message about hiding their emotions is that they don't get to do the nuanced trial and error work over the course of years to get to a place where they can name the issue. Can you just bring it down a little for me? Because I get reactive about that. They don't get to do that trial and error work. So what we're talking about in relational practices is inviting boys and girls and non-gender binary kids into the daily back and forth of expression. And sometimes it's messy, and sometimes it's emotional, and sometimes it's challenging, right? But ultimately, these relational capacities, we have 6 on our wheel. Based on culture and identity and style of family, there are hundreds, right? We're not saying this is it.
Yeah.
We're saying this is a starting point, right? To begin to play with these relational spaces, to begin to create these spaces where we and our children over time do the trial and error, iterative work to learn to connect and communicate in authentic, healthy ways, to learn to connect across difference, to do all the things that our dominant culture of masculinity seeks to train boys out of, and also, to a very real degree, trains girls out of as well.
So I'm thinking,
Yeah,
we're about 30 minutes from our end,
yeah.
that we probably take a few, I don't know, Sharon, if there are any more questions or comments that have come in. Okay, that we take a few minutes to have people reflect on what we've been talking with each other.
Yeah, we can do a little breakout session.
Yeah. And
So what'll happen is, those of you participating on Zoom will automatically get placed in a room with a few other folks, and we'll provide you with a question that you can discuss in that space. And the question, Saliha, is,
so you're thinking, where do you find yourself getting serious, most serious, when you're interacting with children? Where in your life, around what kinds of interactions, do you find yourself getting
really serious, like getting sort of locked down, I don't have many options here, what have you.
So it could be a place, like I get serious with Gus, whatever is in the kitchen or around cooking, or when I feel disrespected. So in whatever the interaction, however you want to name it, it's not the geographical location. It could be the emotional condition, it could be around a task. So where, and it
Be
could
around their health.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's for whether you're a parent, maybe you're a coach, maybe you are a teacher, a nanny,
A grandparent,
grandparent,
whatever,
in whatever capacity you are in relationship to children. Maybe you're a passenger on a flight and you get really mad at children who are crying.
Who knows?
Who knows?
So the opportunity here is just to share a little bit of what feels difficult with some other folks and hear what's going on for them. And it takes we have about 5 minutes, so each person would probably take 60 seconds to talk about what's going on for them.
And you're going to be in the room 4 people?
Yeah.
Yeah.
4 people.
Yeah.
And then the system will automatically return you back to here. For the 5 minutes that they're doing that,
Yeah.
we can ask ourselves to share that same question.
Yeah, where do
you get?
I was going to have Philip answer it for me.
Oh,
Where does Dad get the most serious? And
That's great.
I'm being raised by
for
you.
those who don't know, Mark's son Philip is in the audience here, and Mark just posed a question to him, which Philip very gracefully diverted from.
2 minutes project band.
But I do think that we could just talk for a moment about where our fears really come into play, where they really lock us down. And I'm happy to say that.
I want to hear from Mark.
Well,
Mark.
Let me think for a second.
Well, he looks like he needs a second.
Okay, go ahead.
So
go ahead.
I'm just going to say most of my anxiety is about COVID-related issues of health right now. The mask here versus here, going out into places where there may be a chance of infection, all of that. And it's not as if parenting was hard enough before, but to actually have a real, a real and present threat everywhere all the time really challenges my ability to say, no, I believe everything's going to be okay. I'm not going to make this the thing that defines my frames about Gus's public life when he goes out. He knows more or less how to stay safe, and I'm going to have to accept the risk here in order not to damage my relationship with him by trying to control him too much in ways that I know with a person who's almost 17 years old isn't going to work anyway. What about you, Mark?
So I think I would say that I get the most tense when I anticipate that some deeply ingrained narratives that I hold are about to unfold. And it really bothers the hell out of me because I can actually see it happening.
Right.
And yet I go over the waterfall anyway.
Right.
You know, and
Wait, so
just,
you're-
and explode.
The
and,
narrative
you know,
is accurate or not helpful, or?
I think that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah. It
some
becomes
of
the only
time.
way you see the event.
It's the only way I see the event. And
Yeah.
that's why I was so taken by your book, because it's like, no, I could try to go into these moments with just holding uncertainty, or perhaps thinking that maybe an entirely different outcome
Right.
is possible.
Yeah.
You know, that the narrative is only a fabrication that really doesn't exist. You know, I think it's really hard when those patterns get ingrained in
yeah.
you. But anyway.
That's a rich one. The narrative is a fabrication, right? I think what you're speaking to is we all are meaning-making animals or humans or whatever, however you want to say. I'm using animals in the largest species kind of way, that the most developed of the animal world is the meaning-making capacity we have. And in that moment, there are so many ways we can make meanings, but something happens to us that we drill down to what's a single story of that.
And you have to wonder, because you go there all the time, whether or not on some level you're psychotically attached to it.
There's a groove, you know.
You don't want to let that go.
Saliha talks about a groove.
Yeah.
If you go enough times through the same thought, it starts to create a little groove, and you get stuck in it, right? And then it really is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well,
So
welcome
you
back
want
from...
to hear, right? You want to hear from...
Yeah, welcome back from the breakout rooms. If you don't mind just entering in the comment sections what your observations were about that breakout room subject, but also about the interactions that took place there. Did you notice any sense of connection to other people when they told their stories? Did you have a sense of that you felt a little bit unburdened by being able to share some of these ideas? We had a similar conversation here about what our own anxieties were, and for me, in that moment that we share those things, I feel better. I feel like I'm not alone in that sort of struggle or that anxiety, which is, I make that a relational moment. And while you were entering that stuff in, I want to talk briefly about the mechanism of relating. Because when we talk about relational spaces, what we're talking about is the process of relating, the back and forth of expression, tone, content, maybe context. All of these things together, words create the relating. And the relating takes place moment by moment. What I say to Mark, what his expression is, what he then says back to me, what I say to him next. And in that process of relating, the back and forth, emotions emerge, right? So when we, I may say something to Mark that causes him to have a sense of joy or humor. And then he says something back to me, and I'm a little troubled by it, perhaps. And I say, well, what did you mean? And then I say something back. So the emotions that emerge in the back and forth of relating are a product of both of us together. And I want to go back to one thing I said earlier real quickly here. When we tell our sons, don't show your emotions, what we're doing in that moment is cutting them off from creating relationships, because emotions emerge in the back and forth of relating, and relating is moment by moment. And if a relationship is struggling in a moment in that relational space, I can look in there and say, hey, I'm sorry for what I said. I don't think you understood me completely. Let me say it a different way. I see your... And we can grow connection again back into that space. But we have to be willing to see emotions and express emotions, or that system is cut off.
Well, and it sounds like we also need to be able to acknowledge that attached to that emotion is a narrative of some sort, that we interpret that emotion and attach a feeling to it that actually has a whole tale that goes back to a lot of things in our lives. And what's so interesting to me is that that it's at any point it's possible to actually change that feeling if you're aware of the narrative tale that goes along with it, because you can choose to interpret the very same emotion in a completely different way.
Absolutely. And you're speaking to two other capacities that we have in that wheel. One is reframing our stories, and the other is context.
Right.
Frames become context over time, and we cannot understand things without creating stories. Stories are meanings that we attribute, we make, but that's the piece where play comes in. How can I hold this frame lightly? Just now earlier when Mark was saying something and he said, I have to give it context. I say, yeah, you're the storyteller. I have just framed him as the storyteller. But if I only see him as a storyteller, I don't see any other attributes or capacities or ways of being that he brings into our relationship.
And vice versa, if you see me as a storyteller, you are conversely not seeing yourself as a storyteller.
That's true too, right?
Which is, I think, is not, that's not how I would view you. I view you as an excellent storyteller in a different way than mine is.
Yeah.
But I also want to take a moment, fellow storyteller, and get to this piece on the wheel, reframe our stories, which is so crucial. We all come with stories about other people that sort of allow us in sometimes harmful ways or unhelpful ways to predict what we think they're going to do, and that's self-defining or self-perpetuating, what is it,
Fulfilling prophecy.
Self-fulfilling prophecy then takes hold in that moment. I expect you to respond in this way or that way about the household budget, and therefore you do, because I accentuate it when you do it, and I respond to that thing specifically, and it starts to grow. But the idea of reframing our stories also speaks to the stories we hold about ourselves, and they're hidden. We don't tell them to other people, but we may say, I don't know how to talk to my teenage kid. And if that's your story that you're holding, and every time that gets confirmed in the slightest way, you feel pain from that, and it becomes a bigger story for you, then that story has taken hold of not only your narrative, but the relational space between you and that teenager. And we can, anytime we're ready, reframe that story to something different. Now, I don't advise you to make up a completely inaccurate story, but you can say, I'm committed to learning to speak to communicate and connect emotionally with my teenager. And in that way, you shift it just a little bit. And it's still a challenging narrative, but it's not so frightening that we can't engage it. And maybe in 6 months after that, you'll say, I've learned how to engage with my teenager better.
Can I add to that about storytelling? And then I want to hear what's on this from our participant. That notice what frames you bring. I think in your story you were talking about, are you bringing stories of catastrophe, stories of like things are going to go wrong, fear-based stories, or to earlier point that Mark was making, are we being appreciative frames? Because these stories are the ways by which we are holding the other. These are not just our fears. It's our response to the context, to the situation by which we will engage with our children. And our children are learning to frame stories from the way we are framing our stories. This is what that whole idea of our children learn more by what we do than what we say.
Yes.
This is where it comes from, because our stories are operational. Like if you think about computers, our stories are the operating system. And if we don't notice whether we are holding deficit stories, fear-based stories, versus strength-based, resource-based, faith, I have faith in you, that you can do it. You're going to go at it very differently, and I'm going to see the mistakes you may make, the failures we may have very differently when I say I have faith in you. But if my faith is, you're going to fail, you're not never going to get it right, then you're going to sense that story of mine, and every time you fail, it's not going to grow your sense of confidence in taking risk, in stepping out, is going to be pulling you out of that risk taking.
Our son said once, when he was younger, he said, I live up to people's expectations.
Yeah.
And he didn't mean the positive ones.
Yeah.
And when your child says that to you, you can know and believe that they will lean into the expectations of the stories that we hold, right?
Yeah.
And a story is a narrow thing. It can be more expansive if it's positive and open, but a destructive story is a very narrow thing. And our goal in our family with our son, we had one single idea that we spoke to very early on. And this sounds a little hard, but our goal was we didn't want to break his spirit. We didn't want to break his spirit. In all the business of teaching and telling and making sure he did things right and all of that stuff, we wanted to leave room for his agency and his ability to express authentically who he is. So when we talk about relational capacities, what we're really doing is taking these ideas and inviting him into the space to co-create with us, right?
Yep.
So every game we came up with.
Before you go into the games.
Oh.
Hang on.
Okay.
Hang on.
I'll wait.
I looked at the time.
What?
We have like 13 minutes, and we've been having
Oh,
them.
yes. The feedback. Thank you.
Thank you.
So in the chat, in response to how did it go in the breakout room, we have one report that one group came to the conclusion that it's much easier to be playful and deal with challenges when children are younger. So when they're in the 4 to 5 year old range versus when they're older and a teenager, then they may be challenging you in return as you're trying to address some of these issues. One of the other groups, interestingly, said something similar, which is even though there were parents of children of different age groups in that breakout room, that when the parents of the younger children were talking about challenges they had, it seemed very familiar to the parents of the older children who said, oh yes, I remember dealing with that at that age. So, you know, to a certain extent, the issues are universal. The way that you relate to your children may be different based on the age, but you know, the challenges come up over and over again.
So that brings me to this idea that we clarify what's playful. And I think you said it in the opening that it needs a little bit of repetition. So one is that gamification. One is that playing with children and improvising. And the other, I think, that you said was holding things lightly.
Right.
So I'll say this for younger children and turn it back to us as adults. Vygotsky, who has studied children's development, says that children have the ability to separate the object from its meaning. So this is, if I show it, everybody will say it's a pen, right? Children will right away say airplane, arrow, and a hair clip, right? We, as we get older, and this is back to that question of seriousness, we get so serious as adults about the seriousness of life that we don't want you not going to college, for example. How can you not go to college? That's the serious business of life. What's the play here? That breath.
No, it's something I've been thinking a lot about over the last week. We're doing some work in another part of this enterprise, and I was thinking back over the course of my life and realizing that the early part of the life was very much filled with the joy and play, and then there was something that happened. Frankly, it was actually parenting, where suddenly things shifted into this is really serious now, and I've been thinking a lot that we do ourselves a disservice when we forget that we come into this world with a joyful, playful heart, and we need to nurture that and share that. Share that and hold that space open with our kids.
I also want to note that this idea of creating a container for our kids starting very young, when the culture itself wants to shut them down and make them conform and lean them into tasks and tools and all that stuff, This idea that we create a container for them to come in and co-design this parenting relationship with us creates an immense amount of anxiety for us initially, because we feel like we're giving away our ability to control that situation. But I believe that in order to form, I mean, look, there's a point at which a 5-year-old becomes a 20-year-old, and somewhere on that timeline, we say, okay, you're an adult now, good luck, go get them. And if we don't have a process starting early and moving through that, where they gain agency and they co-create with those individuals around them the choice points that they're making, then I believe kids have a really difficult time figuring out what the heck to do when they turn 18 or 19 and are suddenly told, well, it's on you now. So my goal always has been to create this container where our children are able to bring their full selves, express completely what's going on for them, gain that agency of being able to express emotionally in this process of relating, so that they do the trial and error incremental work over the course of years to grow their ability to nuanced expression of self, to connect across difference, and to co-create their lives with us. And what I believe took place is that by giving that agency early on, it was sort of a front-loaded process of having to add these relational capacities in order to contain and move that process forward in a positive, collaborative way. But ultimately, I'm still in conversation with my teenager. He's still telling me what's going on for him, and he's telling me things sometimes that frankly are the scarier things.
Right.
And we've
I
been
smoked
told.
some pot,
Yeah.
or I was talking to these people at the park, or whatever. But he's still coming to me and talking to me, right?
And he's let us know that he'll tell us something in a year and a
Yeah,
half.
he said the other day, something happened a few days ago, I'm going to tell you in 2 years.
He said the clock has
Because
started.
it'll freak you right out.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, man. But we're in connection and we're in conversation. And I believe he's done the nuanced work over time to be able to handle his emotional reactions and responses. Saliha, could you please lower your nose?
Lower my nose.
And this is the deal about all of this in the book, and about the games and the capacities and everything else. What we're trying to do is move children from childhood into this early stage of adulthood with agency and capacity all along the way, so that they are empowered to make choices that they can then communicate rationale for, connection to, let us know when they disagree, let us know when they're going to have to make a different, sorry, Mom, Dad, I'm going to make a different choice. But it's not this idea that somehow they conform to our demands until then they're adults.
And I want to speak to that.
You may.
We think we know what's best for our children, and so we hold them to those demands.
Yeah.
So my question to the parents who are working with teenagers is, how many of those demands can you hold lightly? It's not about your child, but our expectations. How many of those can we hold lightly?
Not very many, I would imagine. They're all probably pretty serious demands.
Right. So what is it to play as parents of teenagers, or even adults, 20-year-olds who are, is the play of imagination. It's the dialogue of pluralities. Because when we have a demand, when we have an idea of what they should do or who they should become, there are many possibilities there. We are holding that one single story.
Yeah, even within that demand.
Yeah.
Much less outside of it.
Yeah. So I want to read a quote. This is from a bioethicist, American philosopher, Hildy Lindemann, rather. And she says, "We simultaneously develop and maintain personal identities through interactions." And that's what we've been talking about here. Relationship as interactions, not as roles, but as interactions. So we develop these identities. Simultaneously, we develop plural identities through interactions with others who hold us in our identities. The emphasis is in our identities. So unless, if you're my parent, unless you get curious about what is emerging for me, I don't think you can hold me in my identities. So what you're holding me is in your identity of who I should become. And that's the toughest thing for parents to let go.
Yeah.
And this book, her book is, I think I'm going to say it wrong perhaps, Holding and Letting Go, something like that. And I would recommend this to anybody. It's about death, it's about life transition, it's identities, it is about things that we still don't know that are emerging in relationships. What do we hold and what do we let go?
Yeah.
And that really is what I mean by play in terms of that which is and that which is becoming. And that's the play of dialectics. Society, as we know, has been shifting over time, but there's always been that which we value and that which is coming into being. And we all struggle in that dialectics, right? So that's, I think, what parenting is. And I love it. Dad as the project.
Yeah, Dad is the project.
Right.
I think what's interesting is that we're now at a stage in our lives and our relationships where, because we've been on a lifelong journey of identity formation and self-discovery, and I mean we, meaning the boys and I individually, and also in our relationship. We're at a point now where they are able to actually interact with me and say to me, you know, Dad, that isn't who you are. And it's because we've been on this co-creation, this adventure of figuring out who we are and who we are becoming in tandem and parallel, that they have this unique gift of being able to actually see me, we brought that up, in ways that I cannot see myself.
That's beautifully said, yeah.
And I hope that it's the same for them.
Yeah.
And I'd also like to speak to something here in closing. When I engage in parenting in this more open, co-designing way, I have not given up my authority as a parent. That is not what this is about. What I have done is I have decided to help my child grow into adulthood through a process of collaboration over time, which moves power from me as an authority in his life to him and invites him to grow into all of the nuanced ways in which he needs to be able to learn to work with that. 90% of that is embedded in relationships. Relationships will be what gives him a satisfying life or an unsatisfying life if he fails to learn how to create them in healthy, authentic ways. But when I need him to respect my authority, he does, because I don't call on it very often. And when I do, I have so much goodwill in the bank from all of the times I've said, okay, I'll think about that. You know, maybe you're right. I have enough in the bank that when I need to call on him to respect my authority about a decision, he says, okay. And I consider that to be a gift to me in that moment. He doesn't have to. He's 17. He could throw down any way he wanted. But I consider that a gift to me that's a byproduct of the investment I've made in co-designing our lives together and really trying to validate who he is as a human being. And the payback and the bank is huge, and the transaction there is sometimes just, okay, Dad. Okay, Dad. But I haven't thrown down with him very often with that, and I do it sparingly. I'd rather him arrive at his own reason for doing what makes sense.
Well said. I think my closing is this is an ongoing, unfinished conversation. and don't mark any moment as the marker of it's set in stone.
So I think we're getting to the end of our session today, and we've covered a lot of ground, yeah, given everyone a lot to think about. Thank you, Saliha and Mark, for being with us today. And I don't know whether we have a slide of the book that we could pull up, but just so that everybody knows, the book is the relational book for parenting, and we will have some copies here at the center for people to borrow. And of course, it's available on Amazon and other places. I highly recommend it. It's surprisingly easy to read, and having read it now 3 times, I can also tell you that it's surprisingly and deceptively simple. There's many things in it that you can actually undertake immediately and implement in your homes, and you will benefit from thinking about how to do so for many, many years to come.
And if you'd like to go to thinkplaypartners.com, you can download a 90-page sample copy of it. There's a link right there. Just scroll down to that section of the homepage and you'll see the book and information about it in that link. And you can download a PDF of about the first 90 pages. So.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.
Thank you for having us, and thank you everyone out there
Thank you all for participating.
sharing your feedback and holding space for this conversation. I know it may be in some ways a little bit new and different than some of the conversations about parenting.
All right, with that, we'll sign off. Be well, everyone. Happy trails.